Welcome to Assume Nothing episode 8. This is A Deadly Diagnosis, our series finale, and we start this where everything began for John Bodkin Adams, where I stand, right here, Randalstown, County Antrim, Northern Ireland. John was born here and spent his early years growing up in the town. So too did I, but I'm adamant to reiterate we are not related as far as I know. We have our audience ready in the Accidental Theatre and our panel of experts. We'll meet them in a moment. First though, let's remind ourselves of the journey of Dr. John Bodkin Adams in our series so far. John studied at Queen's University and became a GP. He went on to set up shop in Eastbourne and amassed a collection of patients, many wealthy and elderly. Then, the death of patient Bobby Hollett drew the attention of the police. Scotland Yard were on the case and assigned DS Herbert Hannam to the investigation. A pattern seemed to emerge in the doctor's behaviour. Adams had been giving large doses of drugs to his patients, barbiturates, heroin and morphine. The investigators claimed Adams was trying to control his patients with drugs, get them to put him in their wills, and then he'd bump them off. The investigation focused on 1946 to 1956. In that time frame, he issued 310 death certificates. Of those, 163 were said to be suspicious and 132 left him money in their wills. In that 10-year period, John was left £100,000 in wills from his patients every single year. He also was left different items from them, some in wills and some he would simply take from their houses himself. And they ranged from huge items like Rolls Royces to slightly odd items like false teeth. He was tried for the death of Edith Morrell in 1957 at the Old Bailey. There was drama in court as the nurses who testified against the doctor were shown to be inaccurate in their testimony. Dr. John Bodkin Adams was found not guilty of the murder of Edith Morrell, but guilty of other lesser offences. However, as we covered in the series, there were many who felt the investigation and the trial were seriously flawed. We explored documents that suggested there were serious influences on the investigation and the trial that altered the outcome, involving gay lovers, the British Medical Association, the Assistant Chief of Police in Eastbourne, and more. Many believe what Dr. Adams was actually doing was a type of paid-for euthanasia. And as we looked at in the series, as a result of the investigation into him, the law was changed to protect doctors. Despite that, even many years later, what some believe is that John was actually a mass serial killer. Given that you've listened to our series, what do you believe is the truth?
The doctor will see you now.
Round of applause, please, for our panel of experts. We have criminologist Peter Squires, psychologist Dr Carol Guinan, and from Queen's University, lecturer in law, it is Dr John Stannard. We're going to start with you, Pete, and we're going to talk about conspiracy, or alleged conspiracy that we should say, in this series. And the story, it was like a cake layered with different elements of that. What were the key aspects of those conspiracy theories for you?
Well, some of them are cultural. The idea that a doctor is larger than life, an authority, and you can't question him. And I think that was a stance the BMA were keen to retain. They wanted the power and authority. They were in negotiation with the government, so there's a bigger picture here. They were in negotiation with the government around the remuneration of doctors. We're in the early ages of the NHS, and doctors were not happy with the deal they were getting. So keeping doctors sweet was also part of the picture. I think then there's the kind of conspiracy in Eastbourne. The doctor, the magistrate, the mayor, the chief constable are the power elite locally. And Adams knew them all. He was part of that little network. Now, whether they were corrupt, whether they were gay, which is something that came out later, is part of the kind of rumour around this, that in a way it seems very much in, we talk about sort of circling the wagons. I think the elite in Eastbourne circled the wagons to protect one of their own, who I think they thought was not really doing any wrong.
So do you think that they thought he was innocent, or do you think that because of his status as a doctor, they thought it was really important to protect him because the impact of a doctor found guilty of murder in the early days of the NHS, that would have been detrimental to the service?
It would certainly have been detrimental. Whether they... we look back on Adams from the perspective of Shipman, who killed 250 and was a much more bang to right. So he looms large in our, back reflection on the Adams case. Whether they thought he was guilty or just reckless or incompetent or maybe just pushing the envelope too far, I'm not sure. That's the $64,000 question. But I think they thought there was more at stake than his guilt. And what was important was not to make waves, not to disturb the sort of neat setup that they'd got. And certainly not to upset the BMA.
Yeah, that's quite a grim way to look at it, though, not to upset, given the potential of what he could have been doing. And obviously the BMA, we talk about this in the series, they advised their doctors not to participate in the inquiry. But what they said they were doing was simply trying to protect their doctors because they believed he was innocent. And this, was possibly going to tar the reputation of all their doctors.
Yes, I think that's very clear, yes. So they don't want that, they don't want the lid of that box opened at all.
In terms of the decision to prosecute him for the death of Edith Morrell, they looked at that 10-year period in particular, and there were so many options of deaths that they thought were suspicious. And some people believe that that is another element of this alleged conspiracy, that, they picked Edith Morrell because she had been dead for a long time, her body had been cremated, and therefore, potentially, the case against Adams for Edith's death was a weak one. Do you think, is there any substance in that?
I mean, my look at the prosecution case, such as it was, it's not unusual for sample cases to be selected when you have a multiple offender. Sample cases are the way they can make it manageable. There was not just Edith Morrell, there was another case as well. Now, the issue, there's a coincidence here, because the trial was 1957. 1957 was also the year in which the new Homicide Act was passed, which would have had an implication for the sentence. Murder was still a capital crime. He could have been hung for this. But the Homicide Act changed the law in respect of homicide so that a doctor or anyone convicted of a poisoning of only one person would no longer be executed.
Okay.
And so it needed a second case. It needed a second case for two reasons. One was so that they could show a system or a pattern of malpractice that amounted to beyond negligence and potential homicide. So they needed, but then they dropped one of the cases and were left only with the Morrell case, where the body had gone, there was limited evidence, and it was a long time ago, and all the difficulty of producing witnesses for an offence that was a long time. And it was rather badly handled by the prosecution, one has to say. So it looks like a mistake. And what about justice for the other 150-odd victims that...
Assuming they were victims.
Assuming they were victims.
Yeah. John, we've touched on this slightly already, but in terms of the social points around this, the fact that he was a doctor and the high esteem they were held to, the idea was you couldn't challenge a doctor, or shouldn't, because surely a doctor would never do something like that.
I think that's right. The doctor was always... even now, I think doctors are held in greater respect than other professions. Now then, the idea that you would accuse the doctor... In fact, that was one of the very things that Bodkin Adams said on his famous remark on his arrest: you can't accuse a doctor. There was almost a sort of surprise there. Surely you're not going to accuse. I mean, crimes are committed by the criminal classes. Crimes are not committed by people like you and me, and certainly not by people you respect. The people to whom in rural England you would touch your forelock. The squire, the parson, and the doctor. So the idea that a doctor would do a thing like this, I think, would be go against the grain, if you see what I mean. So I always think that my own feeling about the Bodkin Adams case is, I know that there was all this gossip, there were all these a large number of people who he was accused of having poisoned, but it was still, to my mind, certainly in 1957, a big ask trying to get a conviction.
Because he was a doctor. Because he was a doctor.
Well, for various reasons. I think there are a number of reasons why it was a big ask, but that is one of them. Why it was, the very idea of a doctor. There were other reasons too, but I think that was certainly had a big part to play.
There were so many different. We mentioned that the layers in that cake. So the fact he was prosecuted for one death only, the suggestion of the lovers of influence. So the deputy chief of police in Eastbourne, Alexander Seekings, and Sir Roland Gwynn, a chairman of the magistrate. So they were people that had serious connections. So the potential is there that made a difference. Yes, there is that potential, certainly. That can't have helped. I mean, let's just put it that way. I mean, whether you can say whether we can't know now whether there had been a conspiracy or not, but that can't have helped. But there are other factors too. I think even without that, I think there'll be other reasons why I think it would have been very, very difficult to prosecute Bodkin Adams for murder. Even now, I think it would be difficult. What's the key elements from that, the other factors? What do you think? Well, I mean, let's look at what Bodkin Adams said. As I say, he perhaps, if I may be forgiven for defaming the dead, you can't defame the dead, but I don't get me in trouble. Perhaps the sharpest knife in the box, as far as Queen's graduates were concerned. But he did put his finger on, I think, on the difficulties in his remark. Easing the passing, he said, is not morally wrong. That they wanted to die, you can't accuse a doctor. Now, there are four things there, I think. There is the thing we've been talking about, the social difficulty in accusing a doctor and getting a conviction of remember, there was a jury qualifications in those days. You had to be a respectable gentleman with a property qualification before you sat on a jury back in the 1950s. So there was a certain cachet about that. The doctor was one of us. There were legal difficulties. You've got to prove in a case like this that the doctor brought about the death. And he caused the death. This is the easing the passing. This is the euthanasia or possible euthanasia. Well, it isn't quite so much that. That's a slightly different point. But you've got to prove that the patient wouldn't have died then anyway. That the doctors actually advanced the time of death. Now, that's obviously where you get a case where the doctor murders his wife, as in the case of Buck Ruxton in Lancaster. It's obvious the doctor did it with its own patient. If you get a case like Dr. Cox, who used potassium chloride, which the only thing you can use that for is to stop the heart, as far as I can see. But when you're using painkillers,
You know, that's a slightly different thing. You know, the patient is dying already. And then, of course, there's a thing about you've got to have the guilty mind. You've got to have the guilty intent. You've got to, your purpose has got to be to kill or do serious injury. Adams would have said, I wasn't trying to kill them. I only wanted to relieve their pain.
Yeah.
Even now, that would be, you know, that's a very, very grey area. A doctor can say that, provided I am doing what is necessary to relieve pain. You know, the fact that I know it will incidentally hasten the death is can leave amount of elbow room, as we lawyers say, for a jury to acquit.
Okay, and we'll come back to the issue of the
it's a complicated
assisted dying. Carol, can I ask, when it comes to the likes of conspiracy or using your advantage with people in your life, perhaps manipulating them, does that say something about the personality of an individual, or is that simply what we would all do if we were in a certain circumstance, like being on trial for murder?
I think what strikes me about how Bodkin Adams is spoken about is first and foremost as a doctor. And what's interesting to me is to get beneath that label and just to see him as a man. And I don't think that there is anyone in this room or any one of us has the kind of luxury of feeling inoculated against any of those kinds of feelings, like, I don't know, jealousy or entitlement or a sense of superiority or inferiority. There's something about his position as a medical professional and one who is working in isolation as a GP, that I think creates pretty fertile ground for someone with malicious, I'm not going to say with malicious intention.
Well, potentially, you know.
But who is bestowed with a great deal of power and has the means to execute whatever he sees fit, you know. So, yeah, I think it is him as a person, his disposition, his place, his status as a medical professional, the fact that he's unchallenged and almost unchallengeable, and then protected by this various systems around him.
And there was an obnoxious element to the doctor's story as well, where he did not doubt himself or his abilities. So that might be the type of personality where he didn't question what he was doing. Not really, or maybe only on a surface level.
So I'm thinking about this from the point of view as a psychotherapist, right? And I'm thinking, where is the potential for change in this man? And I'm thinking, if he is working as a doctor, there's evidence of, I don't know, disproportionate numbers of people dying, and you know, the fact that he's not doing a very good job.
No.
You know, he's failing as a doctor, and he's failing with a capital F. You know, the capital F referring to the fact that he's not learning from his mistakes. You know, if it's about incompetence, if it's about making mistakes, there's no awareness of that.
And is that a personality trait, or is that a lack of intelligence?
It's something about a concrete approach, you know, a very, very concrete approach. I mean, I find it very difficult to find anything likable about this man.
Pete, do you disagree? Is it something you liked?
I don't disagree at all. I think that's right. But you look back to his career, first at Queen's when they thought he was a rather plodding student. Later, when he qualified as an anaesthetist, they thought he was a bungler and incompetent. So I think it builds a pit. There are 3 occasions where he moved on from a place where he had been proven to be incompetent or incapable or
Yeah.
not up to scratch. So I think you're
There's
on
a
the
sense
right track
of
there.
that sense of being a misfit, you know, maybe like a
Yeah.
overachiever with a kind of lower than average capability.
Which is not who you want as a doctor, to be fair, as treating you.
But, you know, I think, can I come in there?
Yeah.
I think that he had, I think it's not black and white like that. I mean, he actually could do what a lot of doctors can't do, is the bedside manner.
Uh-huh.
And there's more and more said now about bedside manner. This is a new thing. With lawyers do it as well. In the old days, it was all book learning. You know, you do this, you do that, you learn the rules. Now it's how you do it. It's emotion. It's you know, relating to other people, and that he could have
He
done
could,
well.
but I think some people would disagree that it was a positive way. Some patients did really enjoy that close connection that he had, and at a different time as well. You know, he had patients in their grand homes he would go to visit. Now you might struggle to get your GP on the phone, so the relationship and the options there are different.
Very different. You got nowadays.
But he did have an odd bedside manner. You know,
Of course. Well,
he was
people
over the top a
continued
little
to
bit.
go to him even after he was convicted.
He was attentive, that's for sure.
Well, good.
But I think we'd call it a form of coercive control these
Well,
days,
you know,
or a kind of grooming behaviour. He made them dependent upon him.
What do you think of that, Carol?
I mean, he strikes me as someone kind of who inhabits the persona of the abuser.
Yeah,
Like that's my sense of him.
I don't know.
Well, and the idea that he's not demonstrating any awareness of the impact of his behaviour on his patients. There's an isolation. He keeps family, friends at a distance, and he makes himself completely indispensable.
There's almost like a romantic element which never seemed to go anywhere, but there was the thought from some of them that one referred to that's my John, or had pictures
Yeah.
of him. Which if you had a picture in your house of your GP now, people would...
Do you not have one?
No, I do not.
He there's an over familiarity about him
Yeah.
in the space he takes up in people's lives. I think over familiarity, but an intrusive quality. There's an intrusive quality. My sense of him was something like how he uses people, and mostly women, I think, uses them to advance his own gains, you know, and not just materially, but in terms of how they make him feel, you know, and there's a superficiality about his relational style that's very surface, seems to, you know, be outwardly very committed to the work, always available, working very, very hard, but in a way that is very intrusive. Like he's not always wanted.
Although, as John
you know?
said, some people did like that. You know, there was an appeal there, but perhaps that is because he did target, maybe that's the wrong phrase, but a lot of his patients were elderly and they lived, what was the phrase for Eastbourne?
Oh, I used to live in Brighton, and Eastbourne is 17 miles along. They call it God's waiting room.
Yeah, so
Lovely name for a town.
some made the argument that he had purposely gone for that town or stayed there because the people there maybe were lacking in love or attention, and he fulfilled that to an extent which gave him that access.
I think his gender helped him. So he was a man. And I think maybe in that time, the 50s, 40s, where you're a widow, it's very hard to be a widow, very hard to be a single woman in your elderly years as well. I think it's quite a vulnerable position, so socially vulnerable position. And he really filled that gap, you know, as a man, without question.
Does that make him, we hear these phrases and buzzwords like sociopath. Does that make him a sociopath, or is it narcissism, or is it a combination?
I think it's maybe like when we're trying to reverse engineer a diagnosis like this, it's a bit difficult. So I'm thinking of elements of narcissistic personality. These things didn't exist, I think, back then, even in the 40s, 50s.
Did they not exist, or was the label just not there?
Oof, well,
So,
that's a debate.
Okay.
So I don't think there was a psychiatric classification that included narcissistic personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder. These are more recent creations. It doesn't mean that these behavioral traits, tendencies, abusive dynamics did not occur. Of course they did. But there is a diagnosis, I don't think, helps us get to the depth of his personality and his motives and his intentions. We don't know a lot about his early life, his relationships growing up. There's a few different theories, I think. But I do want to point out that intelligence is not a factor when it comes to crime. It is a factor when it comes to getting caught, you know.
It's a very good point.
And the more intelligent people are better at getting away with it.
But committing the crime in the first place, intelligence doesn't necessarily come in there.
No, it does not. Well, I mean, that's what the research would say. Research would hold that up. It's about it's the susceptibility to getting caught, and then it links with status and resource about how you defend yourself.
As part of the series, we mentioned the sealed files. Anyone find that intriguing? Yeah. Now, they were sealed in the 50s until 2033. Now, file closures are not completely unheard of, so this wasn't some absolutely weird, bizarre thing to happen. These things do. However, the closure did kind of fuel speculation or allegations of a cover-up. But what I didn't tell you in the series was that we actually based most of the series on the files because they were opened in 2003 at the request of an historian, Pamela Cullen. Now, speaking generally, files are closed based on a few factors. It can be regulations at the time, and they can change over periods, but also the ownership of the files. Now, this was a Met Police investigation. He was tried in the Old Bailey, and they maintain the ownership of them, but the National Archives, they actually store them on behalf of them. Now, I've been speaking to Jessamy Carlson from the National Archives, and she explained the possible reasons behind the sealings of any files.
It's usually around protection of an individual, so it's because there's personal information that's included in there that would be inappropriate to release during their lifetime. That's a really common reason for a record to be closed. It could be that information's been revealed in confidence and that there isn't a reasonable expectation that that information would be revealed during the lifetime of that person.
Now, we asked the Met, who again own the files, why they were closed in the first place. And they gave us a little bit of a runaround. I wanted to know why they had sealed the files. And eventually, they did give me an answer to that, and they said they don't know. I asked for more and was told, due to the time of the transfer and organisation's changes, they have been unable to locate any record of why they were sealed. Now, I say that, again, repeating, the closure, the specifics are set with the owners and with regulations at the times. Pete, your thought on that in terms of the lack of information from the Met, like why they can't pinpoint their reasoning for the closure?
Well, I mean, I've done lots of research with and on and for the police, and I would say it's always like trying to get blood out of a stone most of the time. So I'm not surprised. Other people have alluded to the fact that there were high political issues here. The Attorney General was involved, government ministers, the BMA, the Chief Constable of Eastbourne Police. So there were lots of kind of threads here. And it was a high-profile trial that failed from the prosecution point of view. There was important politics in play. There was an act of parliament that changed the goalposts around the very nature of the offence that was being tried. So protecting an individual, maybe, but I think protecting the institutions, much more likely.
So do you believe that is an aspect as to why they were sealed?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Now, the National Archives themselves...
They don't like stuff coming out that
but
shows
of course,
them in a bad light.
What could be said, and they may say, is that there's reasoning for protecting certain elements of information. We heard what Jessamy said there. These things can be quite complicated, and files the files in this case were huge, thousands of pages. Mm-hmm. Like, they interviewed thousands of people. Literally, it sounds bizarre, but they did. And the file for the trial, which we based the series on, the researcher, the specialist that helped me, said it was the biggest single file he had ever seen in many years working there. Now, the National Archives, did give me some general information to sealing of files, referring to timeframes, records, etc. Now, they can range hugely, the number of years that files can be sealed for. They said privacy concerns, as you heard Jessamy say there, photographs, medical information, that information could relate to Dr. Adams in this case. Mm-hmm. It could relate to the victims or other patients.
Well, he was still alive until 83.
Absolutely.
So in a sense, there is issues of reputation. He'd been found not guilty. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, that's a factor.
But they also told me...
I'm thinking that as pretext.
They told me that one of the other reasons for closing files could be to prevent people from accessing them purely on curiosity or scandal mongering. So I guess that's suggesting that people, maybe that's people like me, would want to look not for any particular grand reason of another prosecution or something like that, but just because there is a curiosity there.
It's the problem that the moment that you make something more secret, the moment you close the file, you set the conspiracy theories running. And there have been conspiracy... I counted 14 books about the Bodkin Adams case. I mean, I've not read them all, but it's been a fascination because of what it exposes around the people are obsessed by murder and true crime anyway in this country. I've always thought that was a bit odd, even as a criminologist.
Apologies for that particular comment there.
Sorry, nothing meant to... But,
so glad you're here, Pete.
Yes. It helps. But you're right. I mean, that opens up the floodgates for anything to kind of be said. Yeah. In the absence of information.
I guess my point is
the imagination runs.
And I don't mean to counter what you say or to represent them, but the argument could be that we don't necessarily need to have access to all levels of information that are out there. Now, the National Archives did tell me, so initially it was a 75-year period for most of the files, but actually it wasn't 70 or 75 years, it was 30 years for a lot of the files in the Bodkin Adams case. And then they extended those closure periods. So not that long, 30 years is a considerable amount of time, but not that long after it, but he was still alive. They were extended again for up to 70 or 75 years. Now, I did ask Jessamy about the suggestions of a cover-up in relation to hiding, sealing, whatever you want to describe the files, and this is what Jessamy told me.
There is information. There are people out there who deserve to be protected through that, and murder cases are very rare. In fact, any criminal case, it's always complicated. There's always multiple players. And it would be really unusual for a file simply to refer to one person throughout. There's almost always multiple people in multiple places coming into those investigations. And I think it's helpful to bear in mind that it's far more complicated in terms of like what those files refer to.
Any questions at this point that you want to share on yes, at the back?
I'm Ruth Adams. We met, myself and my sisters, along with my parents, met Uncle John. He was a cousin of my father's.
And what was he like?
He was scary. We visited him during our holidays when we were in Dorset. We went to his home in Eastbourne. We didn't exactly know how we were related to him. His surname and our surname were the same. That was it. His eyes rolled in his head, which was really scary, wasn't it, Fiona? Both of us are both nurses, many years, and I've never met anybody like him. He wore a 3-piece suit with a cravat and a dicky bow. He had a pocket watch, and he was very religious.
Was he pleasant? I know, for younger children, a doctor could seem a bit...
He was relatively old when we met him.
Yeah.
Maybe 4 or 5 years before he passed away.
So he was in his maybe late 70s?
Yeah, it was the late 70s when we went to visit him. So he was probably in his late 70s. For us, he was just scary. He was quite squat and very rotund, very stout, sweaty face, and like a milk bottle glasses round. He was quite ugly, actually. I shouldn't say that.
No.
But yeah. No, he wasn't warm and cuddly.
No.
But he had patience. When we were visiting, he went out to see a patient for about 20 minutes, and the second time we visited, the patient was just leaving. So he was still a GP and still quite busy.
Because he was reinstated, of course, after he lost his licence. But in terms of your family and that connection, was there ever any mention of the kind of dark suggestions around him? Do you remember that as a child?
Father that he didn't commit the crime. That's all we know. He didn't discuss it in front of us. We did go out in the Rolls Royce. We went out. He took us out to see all his cars, his collection, his chauffeur, his maid.
Italian dinner. We never tasted the like in our lives.
Yeah. He had a bomb shelter. We went down to see that. With loads of, he was a clay pigeon shooter, and he did try out for the Olympics. I think that was the year the Olympics was cancelled. So he didn't ever perform in the Olympics, but he was president of the local gun club. Right. So we saw all that. We saw all his guns. We weren't really that interested, but anyhow, we had to sit like good children and listen to it.
And then as a student nurse, years later, a photograph of our Uncle John was up and said it changed the nursing notes forever. So
tell me more about that.
Know that.
So was there, when you were told about these changes?
Yes. He changed the controlled drug registers, and there was none prior to that.
And was there a picture, when you were learning about that, was there a picture of him?
Yes.
That must have been slightly unusual in your training to become a nurse.
Very unusual. We didn't really realise we were kept. That aspect was kept from us.
And can I ask, your decision to go into nursing, was that anything to do with, in terms of, let me finish, the medical interest, the fact that he was a doctor, other people in the family perhaps into medicine, did that have anything to do with it?
We had an uncle, a consultant, and we had aunts, nurses, and... No.
The reason I ask, because obviously there's an element of a caring nature within the family, but that isn't necessarily the kind of vibe you get from Dr. Adams. Caring wasn't necessarily what was his initial target.
Isn't it really difficult to know? I think, and I find it actually quite interesting, the idea of caring as a profession. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
And it kind of clashes against the stereotype of the carer.
Because you make the assumption that it's someone that goes into a really hard profession where you don't necessarily get paid very well and you have to do really hard work, that you would do it because you want to care for others.
See, I think we kind of beatify the carers, and we saw this so acutely during COVID, the clapping and the glorification of carers. I think it's a really difficult profession, and we don't want to engage with, the public doesn't want to engage with the carer as a human being. They don't really care for the carers other than the carer that is there for them, in that role. I think it's an enormously difficult profession in whatever capacity you do it in. And, I think the levels of burnout now in carers, in nurses and doctors, medically, is enormous, So anyway, that's just relevant. That's of relevance now. But to kind of glorify the carer, the doctor, that you can only see that about them.
So do you think that was maybe part of the appeal then for him? Again, that status as someone that could be so wonderful to give their professional life to looking after other people?
I can only say, my impression of it, and I think there is something about this man as a misfit or an underachiever, or somebody on the edge of things, without any awareness of himself at all. There's something.
He maybe felt there was something lacking in his life, and this was one way to try and fill that.
I think maybe that's it, like that he could gain his sense of himself through what he was doing.
Because you heard there in terms of the class, like the fancy dinners, the fancy cars, everything was extravagance. Again, the status symbols, I am worthy, I am good enough, I can prove that even though I came from Randallstown, which is where I'm from, but maybe he felt like he was lacking.
I think there's some references to his early life in Jane Robbins' book.
Yes.
The early life and his regard for his mother as the holiest woman in the country.
The holiest woman in Ireland, yes.
The holiest woman in Ireland. Like there is some kind of glorification going on there. That's going to be hard to be based fully in reality. His father, I think, was the pastor, brethren.
They were very religious. His father died and his brother died as well, Bodkin Adams' brother. And I think at that point, maybe there was more expectation or pressure on John to carry the family on.
Yeah, perhaps like that weighed on him quite heavily. And I think he also had a breakdown during his medical studies.
While he was at Queen's, yes.
Yeah, but he managed to pass. So it's always like a little bit kind of limping behind or labouring under expectation and not quite reaching that.
Yeah.
I think that's, not in any way to say his behaviour can be excused, but it's a part of the kind of maybe the ground that some of the fertiliser, to...
Yeah. And I think it links into some of the slightly odd behaviour, bedside manner, whatever you want to call, where he would turn up to people's houses, to patients' houses at dinner time on purpose with his mother and his cousin in the car and be like, my mum is here, can I come in? Just slightly odd behaviour you would not do.
This is about entitlement, isn't it? Like, I think it reflects his entitlement, his arrogance, his lack of self-awareness, and his connection with his mother and his cousin. Like, I don't think there was any degree of separation there. Like, he never really stood on his own 2 feet.
Yeah.
He brought his mum and his cousin with him and kind of in a very demonstrative way, like raising the standard for everybody, materially, maybe, providing, the overindulging, amassing all of the wealth and the money and, and not doing anything with it, you know.
Well, we'll get to that more in just a moment. Another question at the front here, just a second, we'll get the microphone to you.
I really appreciate what you said there because I'm a carer and I'm involved in end-of-life care and I've been doing it for many years. Never once would I have... there is a lot of suffering, there's no doubt about it. And we do like to ease people's passing, but I don't get handouts for it. I don't expect handouts for it. And actually, listening to you tonight and with the episodes, I think he'd make an excellent modern catfisher. He's got the traits. The traits are there, and if he wasn't doctoring, that could be his second job, because all of the things you've mentioned are the skills of a catfisher.
To pose as somebody...
It's a real exploitation.
Yes, it is. That's absolutely what it is. I mean, all the people I work with and the teams I work with, there's not one person that has ever received any beneficial, monetary, anything like that. There may be donations given to the care home, things like that, but never ever, because our reward is to try the best for the person that's at end of life and their families.
We will come back to more on that in just a moment or two. First, though, I wanted to bring to life a poem that features in the BBC Sounds version of the series. Now, this poem was read aloud in an Eastbourne hotel, and it does give you an indication of how certain people in what was quite an affluent area felt about the doctor while the trial was happening. Please welcome to the stage our actor for tonight, Chris Grant.
In Eastbourne it is healthy, and the residents are wealthy. It's a miracle that anybody dies. But this pearl of English Lido's is a slaughterhouse of widows, if their bankrolls are above the normal size. If they're lucky, in addition, in their choice of our physician, and remember him when making out their wills, and bequeath him their Rolls Royces, then they soon hear angel voices, and are quickly freed from all their earthly ills. If they're nervous or afraid of what a heroine is made of, their mentality will soon be reconditioned, so they needn't feel neglected. They will shortly be infected with the heroin in which they are deficient. As we witness the deceased born from the stately homes of Eastbourne, we are calm, for it may safely be assumed that each lady that they bury in the local cemetery will resurface when their body is exhumed. It's the mortuary chapel if they touch an Adam's apple after parting with a Bentley as a fee. So, to liquidate your oddkin by the needle of the bodkin, send them down to sunny Eastbourne by the sea.
Thanks to Chris, and surprisingly, or maybe not, nobody ever claimed the ownership of that particular poem. He was quite a litigious character, so we'll talk more about that shortly. We're going to talk now on the assisted dying element, which we've touched on already, or indeed, to quote the doctor himself.
Easing the passing of a dying person isn't all that wicked. She wanted to die. That can't be murder. It is impossible to accuse a doctor.
So easing the passing, that gives us an indication, a suggestion of how he felt he was actually doing something rather kind. John, your thoughts on that? Because it is complicated, the euthanasia debate, assisted dying. What do you think?
Well, it depends what you mean by euthanasia, of course. I mean, euthanasia, in a sense, is just a good death. But I think what you're meaning is actually advancing the death. I mean, I think it's obviously a very, very grey area, isn't it?
Well, what is that grey area? Spell that out for us.
Well, the grey area is between the desire to relieve pain and the duty and the desire to not to shorten life. I mean, there's certain things that a doctor can already do in law. I mean, I say a doctor is already allowed to relieve pain, and if they're doing no more than that, if that is what their purpose is, the fact that it will incidentally shorten the patient's life doesn't make them guilty of a crime, doesn't make them guilty of murder. The best way to look at it is this, in my view. Let's say you have a patient, right, who is in great pain. You give them the drugs that you honestly think are needed to relieve that pain. The patient survives. Now, how do you feel about that? Do you say, oh, what a pity, the patient has survived? Or do you say, good, I have managed to relieve the pain and without causing the patient's death? Now, if you apply that to Adams, how would he have felt if the patient hadn't died? If he'd given the morphine and the patient had not died? Now, given the mercenary motive that we see here, and that is due to inherit under their will. You can see why they said, well, this is on the wrong side of the line. But if you don't have that, if you keep on the side of, I am trying to relieve pain and nothing more.
But how do you prove that? Maybe this is
very
the
difficult
grey
to
area,
prove
because
that's why it's so difficult to public.
If early death could come as a result of you trying to ease someone's pain, how do you decide what the initial intention was?
Very difficult. That is why it's almost impossible to. And
accuse
trying
a
to
doctor
think of
as
famous to get the doctor. That's why Bodkin Adams was right to say, well, you're going too far to say you can't accuse a doctor. Of course you can accuse a doctor. Doctors have been convicted of murder, but very rarely has it been convicted of murder of their own patients. The only example I could think of a successful prosecution of that sort is Shipman. I mean, you had Dr. Buck Ruxton who killed his wife, you know, but that's the fact that he was a doctor was incidental there. You had Dr. Arthur, who injected, I think with a child with a painkiller, who was terminally ill. He was gone for attempted murder on the basis that the child could have died anyway. There was a Dr. Cox. Do you remember the case of Dr. Cox? There was a Dr. Cox who was prosecuted for murder. In the case of Dr. Cox, the drug he used wasn't a painkiller. It was potassium chloride, which is not a painkiller. So it is very, very, very difficult to conceive of a case where a doctor using painkillers has actually been, I can't think of one, and it's quite precisely because of the difficulty of proof, precisely because it's very difficult to show that the doctor, given it is a painkiller, was not setting out to relieve pain, and the purpose was not to kill.
And of course, it is important to mention at this point, if...
Double effect.
Well, double effect, but if what he was doing was a form of euthanasia, regardless of anyone's view on it, it was then and still is now, it is murder, because essentially you cannot take money to end somebody's life.
Yeah, but as I say, it depends on what you could call that euthanasia, giving pain, but it's not classified. When we talk about extending the law to allow euthanasia, we're talking about excluding cases like Dr. Cox. Mm-hmm. You're saying if you pass a law saying that you can have that euthanasia, what most would understand like that, certainly what lawyers would understand like that, is extending the exemption so you can, in fact, use something like potassium chloride simply to kill the patient. Yeah. But there is a fine difference.
That's quite different, because obviously the purpose then is to end life,
That's
not
a very,
to
very different
extend,
thing. Yeah.
Not to ease
you're moving
pain.
forward. Yeah. The assisted suicide is moves the law away from what it is at present.
The phrase "angel of mercy" was used as well. Yeah. You know, and again, this kind of harks back to maybe personality traits within him. You know, could he have been convincing himself that he was kind, that what he was doing was what the patients wanted, and they also wanted to give him a Rolls Royce for the favour?
I think what I'm kind of landing on here is the split in his personality, really, that he could maybe be at home with his family, his mother, his cousin, regarded as a lovely man, you know, like regarded as a kind and generous and giving, hard-working, good Christian man who's a doctor and works all hours for the good of his patients. He could be held in mind by the people who know him well in that way. And alternatively, as we're discussing here, that he could also be regarded as a man of with evil, malicious intentions, who's only in the business of doctoring for his own gain.
Because we kind of hear people can convince themselves of almost anything. So could you convince yourself that, you're kind?
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I think so.
And that murder wasn't really murder because they were done.
In my mind, I'm thinking about this, and this is just from my own frame of reference. Yeah. I'm thinking about him as an abuser, like a domestic abuser. Abusers don't see that they're doing anything wrong. There's something in the dynamic between the abuser and the abused that just fits, and that the abuser and the abused just find a way of justifying between them in a way and allowing it to take place. The dynamic just occurs, and both of them can be in this zone of this is normal. That can happen. That does happen.
Yeah. Would the isolation that he displayed a few times with patients, where he would try and restrict families from going near him, would that maybe suggest that he was very aware of what he was doing?
It's very, very difficult to say he has that awareness, because I don't think he's got a huge level of self-awareness.
Yeah. Even if he tells family, don't come to the funeral because they didn't want you there, where possibly they might have questioned a will that came afterwards, or even in some instances weren't aware of the death.
So maybe we're thinking about it as levels of awareness, and that he can move between those levels at different times, in different contexts, depending on the external pressure or the questions around him. So that he could be convicted of forgery and say, yes, I did that, that was bad, but I have already made amends with God about that.
Yes.
That's another way.
God said that was okay.
God said, I've sorted that out, God, that's fine. So there's so many dimensions to it. And I think it's not one thing or another. I think he moves between different levels of awareness, different levels of intention. And it depends on who he's with as well. So not everybody accepted his advances and his care. Some people really, I think, repelled him, said, I'm not having you in my house. I'm not. So there's something in the dynamic between him and the other that generates.
There's also, Pete, there's an element of the ultimate control, because if you preside over the death of somebody, that is possibly the highest level of control that you could have.
Yes, and well, in a sense, it comes out in that notion. I mean, you've talked about angel of mercy, but other people have talked about a kind of God complex, which he derives from his religion. But an element of further culpability comes through when, we think of the 13 offences he was found guilty of. Fraud in relation to cremation certificates, to death certificates, to failing to keep proper record of his drug prescription.
Yeah.
And I think one of the more damning ones, when he lied to the police about what medicines he'd got on his property, but was then found to be pocketing some files of morphine that he denied that he had. So that was, again, obstructing the police. So that's 13 other offences that go to a state of mind that somehow I'm in charge, I write the record, I keep the details, and I'm the one who tells you what's important and what's not important. Yeah. And so I think that's quite damning, really.
Well, we mentioned in this series about the £10,000, which is around $250,000 today, that he got from selling his story. And after he died, in his basement, it was full of all these things that he had acquired, obviously not the Rolls Royces, over the years. It was like storage rooms. So he acquired these items but didn't do anything with them, didn't use them, didn't sell them on for gain. He just had the items, put them away, and that
yes, it sounded like hoarding.
Yeah, that £10,000, which he must have, I assume, would have been as a cheque, cashed, and the 10,000 was still in the original envelope in the storeroom with all the other stuff, from the false teeth to car tires to gold pens to cameras, candlesticks, silver. So he wanted this stuff, but he didn't really want to do anything for it or with it.
Well, you would have to speculate as to the mind of a hoarder. My wife says I'm a hoarder, but not to that extent, and I haven't killed anybody to get it yet.
Glad to hear it.
So it's odd, part of odd behaviour.
Yeah.
Yes.
Carol, again, does that say something about somebody? Maybe it is the sign of a serial killer. Maybe that's too cliche.
I think there's something about the part object relating. I know that sounds a bit complicated, but that he's doing it and then half doing something. You know, he's not actually using this for the betterment of his quality of life. If he's just storing these things, there's something about acquiring these items because he's entitled to have them. He might like them, or he might just look at the like the look of something and he wants it and he'll have it.
Magpie.
Yeah, but I honestly don't know. There's something very ineffective about it.
It's also
just very
possibly
ineffective.
the status element we mentioned earlier, to get these things, but not really having anything to do with them or any want. I've got them. I'm as good as those people, the high class, the wealthy people he was looking after. I'm as good as them.
But there's something really ineffective about it, where he just stores them and doesn't. He knows he has them.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's kind of baffling. I'm thinking, like, when you go on holiday, you get a souvenir. You have that souvenir. It elicits certain thoughts, certain feelings.
Yeah.
It might be a reminder for him of, the person, what he got, what he gained, how he felt. I don't know.
As part of the series, in fact, what initially drew my attention to it, because despite being from Randallstown, I had never heard of this case. And I was at a pub quiz, I mentioned this in the series, and they said there was a plaque in the town that is related or references a possible serial killer. And I thought instantly, that sounds like a commemoration. That's a bit odd, but I was wrong. So I've been along and I've been talking to Linda Houston from the town's Historical Society, who informed me about this. Linda, explain, why is there a plaque for Dr. Adams here?
Well, it's one of 15 plaques that were placed around the town with Heritage Lottery funding back in 2021. And they really try to tell stories of places and interesting people from Randallstown. And this was definitely one of the more interesting stories.
Very much so. So it's not a commemoration.
No, it's chosen because it's such an interesting story and it has resonated down the decades. But we do note that he was notorious for being tried and acquitted. So we were particular about our wording.
I had never heard of Adams or his story before I started to do this programme, and I felt slightly ashamed of that. Do people know about him and his story in the town?
There would be an awareness, certainly among the older generation with their roots in the town. And when we first formed the Historical Society back in '94, this was one of the first stories that cropped up when we started looking around for information, for historical information. So there was quite a broad awareness then, and the story, it seems to me, has definitely resonated down the decades.
Absolutely, it's hard to ignore it once you know about it.
That's true.
Given you've listened to the series and your knowledge, what do you think he was up to?
I think my own opinion is that the man was a monster, and but didn't recognise that in himself.
Round of applause for Linda, who is here. So it is not a commemoration. It's important to note that. Just before we finish up, there are a couple of brief stories we didn't put in the series about the doctor in terms of his behaviour. Pete, tell us about Elizabeth Harris. So this is the living victim, you could describe her as.
Yeah, this was a strange one because he ended up insinuating himself into her life and borrowed money from the family, Eventually, he ended up selling her house for her,
Yes.
but he pocketed the cash, and then wanted to offset some of that against bills that he had, her fees to him.
But
It took 2 years for her to get the money back off of him.
Yeah, he sent this woman to live with his cousin, and then when she said, "Where's the money? 80 grand for my house," he said, sorry, well, there's expenses because you lived with my cousin, and he tried to keep that money for 2 years. And there was also, he sold carpet and lamps and things, and again, she had to fight him for that
But
money.
it's a very unusual level of attention into someone else's life. It crosses all kinds of professional boundaries.
Very, very much so. It's unusual for your doctor to sell your house on your behalf and say it's as a favour.
I mean, present company.
But also, when the cheque came to her, he came and said, "Can you sign that to me and I'll go and cash it?" And off he went.
Yep.
And he cashed that, saved it in his own account and kept that money. Bizarre, wild behaviour. One last story, and this is the possible lucky escape, Mrs. Pike.
Yep.
I didn't know this story until you told me about what happened.
I merely read it in one of the several books about him. She was a patient who was gradually declining under his tender care, and finally, having tried to exclude the family from any kind of dealings with her, the family kind of in the end insisted that another doctor be brought in, and Adams asked to leave, and apparently within a fortnight she was well on the way to recovery. So without his ministrations, she got better.
It's wild. There's one other story of Mrs. Lucille Murray, and she made a complaint about the treatment of her father, Mr. Allen, and it's kind of in reverse to all the other stories that we've heard, in that the doctor was keeping him alive longer than the family thought that they should. He had had a stroke and he was dying, but they were using a feeding tube, etc. So they complained that the doctor kept him living longer than he should have. And when the daughter said, "Well, I can't afford this care, I can't afford to keep caring for my father who's dying," he said, "Don't worry, as soon as we can get the old chap conscious enough to make his mark, as in sign his paper, we can get hold of the money all right." And that's an official quote from him, which is bizarre. It's monstrous.
But I mean, it speaks to his lack of awareness.
Again,
I mean,
yes.
isn't it? Like, he's not a clever man.
No. Just before we wrap, any questions you want to add here? I realise we're over time, but I know there's a few that didn't get to ask their question earlier.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. I think he was actually a very intelligent man. I think he found a talent, not a good one, but he found a talent, and that he wanted to become famous. He wanted to be caught. He gamed the system, and that's why we're talking about him now. What do you think?
Yeah.
Well, if he wanted to be found, do you mean in terms of the trial and to go through that and be found innocent?
It sounded like he was in control the whole time. He had the people behind him to keep that level of doubt there that he couldn't be found guilty. And then he got his license back. He continued trading as a doctor, practicing as a doctor, and that everybody's goal in life is to make a good name for themselves, make a name for themselves, or become, that's
a particular name he was trying to get there,
he's famous, as in he's infamous or whatever,
No, publicity's bad publicity.
It's not unknown. I mean,
bad publicity.
Other doctors. There was Dr. Neil Cream in the who in the Victorian times used to go around poisoning prostitutes with strychnine, and nobody had cottoned on to it. But the police started getting anonymous letters saying this should be investigated, and eventually they caught him. But the funny thing was, who wrote the anonymous letters? Cream himself. wrote the anonymous letters. Again, the idea that he almost wanted to be caught. There was the poisoner, I think of the poisoner Graham Young, who was in Broadmoor as a young man. Then they let him out and he poisoned several other people. Again, nobody had cottoned on to him, but he insisted, I think this should be investigated. Do you think you should look at that? He wanted to be caught. So this is not something that's unknown by any means.
That is all we have time for, though.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for coming down. Please show your appreciation for our panel of experts. Dr. Carol Guinan, Dr. John Stannard and Pete Squires. Do as well, please check out our other episodes from the Assume Nothing series. If you have a suggestion for a story, please drop me an email, vinny@bbc.co.uk. Thanks again for coming down. And remember, whatever happens, assume nothing and good night.